I bought this farm late last fall. The price was low enough that more than one person in town asked me if I was absolutely sure about the purchase. The place had been abandoned for almost 8 years. Empty barns stood at the edge of the property, their doors hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. The storage shed behind the house was half collapsed. Even the fences along the road had started leaning toward the ditch. But the land itself was still good. At least, that's what the realtor told me. Most of the fields just needed to be cleared and replanted, except for the one on the north side of the property. That field hadn't been used in years. Before I signed the paperwork, the realtor said something strange while we were standing near the fence line. He pointed across the northern field and said, "Don't worry about that one." I asked him what he meant. He smiled the way people do when they don't really want to explain something. The previous owner didn't like going out there much. I figured it was just one of those small-town rumors people tell about old land. Places like this always collect stories over time. For the first few weeks after moving in, nothing unusual happened. I fixed parts of the fence, cleared weeds around the barn, spent most of my time preparing the southern fields for spring planting. The north field stayed the same the whole time. Dry corn stalks from years ago still stood in uneven rows across the land. The wind moved through them at night, making a hollow, rattling sound you could hear from the porch. But that was all. Nothing strange. Until one morning. It was early. The sun had barely started climbing above the eastern hills, and a thin layer of fog was drifting slowly across the northern field. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and leaned against the porch railing. From that spot, you can see almost the entire property. The barns, the dirt road, the long stretch of fields running toward the tree line, and the north field beyond the fence. I looked out there the same way I had every morning since moving in. And that's when I saw it. A scarecrow, standing in the middle of the field. At first, my brain didn't really register what I was looking at. It took a few seconds before the shape made sense. A wooden pole pushed into the soil, a crossbeam for arms, an old coat hanging loosely from the frame, and a wide straw hat sitting on top. A perfectly ordinary scarecrow. Except for one problem. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there the night before. The evening before, I had driven my truck across that same field to check the fence line on the far side. My headlights had swept across the rows of dry corn stalks as I turned the truck around. If a scarecrow had been standing in the middle of the field, I would have seen it immediately. But there had been nothing there. Now there was. I stood on the porch, staring at it for a long time. The fog moved slowly across the ground, drifting around the base of the wooden pole. The scarecrow itself didn't move at all, not even when the wind pushed through the dry corn. Then I noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't facing the field. Most scarecrows face outward, so birds approaching the crops see them clearly. This one didn't. It was turned toward the house, toward the porch, toward me. Almost like it had been placed there for only one reason: to watch the house. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe a neighbor had decided to play a joke on the new owner. People in rural towns sometimes do things like that, helping themselves to your land in small, harmless ways. I went back inside for a minute to grab my truck keys from the kitchen counter. When I stepped back out onto the porch again a few minutes later, I glanced across the field, and something about the Scarecrow immediately felt wrong. It looked closer. Not by much, just slightly. Maybe one row of corn closer to the house than before. But I look at that field every single day. I know exactly how far apart those rows are. And I knew one thing for certain. The Scarecrow wasn't standing in the same place anymore. It had moved. Just a little. But the night before, there hadn't been anything there at all. I stayed on the porch for another minute after that. The Scarecrow didn't move again. It stood in the same place in the northern field, the old coat hanging loosely from the wooden frame. From where I was standing, it still looked like an ordinary Scarecrow. But the longer I stared at it, the more certain I became of one thing. I hadn't put it there, and no one had driven onto the property that morning. The dirt road leading to the farm runs right past the house. Any vehicle would have kicked up enough dust for me to see it from the porch. The ground in the field looked untouched. Still, I needed to see it up close. I set the coffee mug on the porch railing and walked down the steps. The dirt path leading to the northern field cut between two old fence posts and ran straight through the dry corn rows. As I stepped into the field, the wind pushed softly through the brittle stalks. They rattled against each other with that hollow sound dry corn always makes. The Scarecrow stood about 50 yards away. From a distance, it had looked ordinary, but the closer I got, the more details began to stand out. The coat was old, not just worn out, but aged. The fabric had faded unevenly, and parts of it looked almost sun-bleached. The sleeves hung down in a strange way, heavy and limp. Most scarecrows are stuffed with straw to give them shape. This one wasn't. The coat simply hung from the wooden crossbeam like a piece of clothing left on a hanger. Another step closer, and I could see the hat more clearly. It was a straw hat, the kind farmers wear during harvest. The brim was cracked in several places, and some of the straw had broken loose along the edges. Whoever made the Scarecrow had chosen things that were already old, things that had been used for years. When I got within 10 feet of it, something else started bothering me. The coat wasn't moving the way it should. The wind was strong enough to move the dry corn around me, but the coat barely shifted at all. It just hung there, heavy, like something inside it was weighing it down. I stopped walking. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the wind move through the field. The Scarecrow was right in front of me now. The wooden pole had been driven deep into the soil. The crossbeam forming the arms had been tied in place with old rope. Up close, the coat looked even stranger. The front buttons were missing. The fabric was pulled tight in some places and loose in others. And when the wind lifted the sleeve slightly, I saw something inside it. At first, I thought it was just dark cloth. But the color was wrong. It was gray, dull and uneven. I took one slow step closer. The wind moved through the corn again, and the sleeve lifted just a little higher. That's when I saw it clearly. There was no straw inside the coat, no cloth stuffing. There was an arm, a human arm. The skin had shriveled tight against the bones, turning a pale gray color. The fingers were slightly curled, stiff and dry inside the sleeve. I stumbled backward immediately. My heart started pounding as I stared at the Scarecrow.
From a distance, it had looked harmless, just a wooden post with old clothes hanging from it. But now I could see the truth. Someone had used a body, a real one. For a few seconds I couldn't move. My eyes stayed locked on the sleeve where the arm hung inside the coat. Then something else caught my attention. The ground around the Scarecrow. Footprints. There were dozens of them pressed into the dirt between the rows of corn. Fresh ones. The soil around them was still loose where shoes had pushed into the ground. I stepped closer to look. The prints led away from the Scarecrow in several directions. They moved through the field for a few yards, then turned, then came back. Every single trail ended in the same place, right where the Scarecrow stood. I followed one of the tracks with my eyes. It led 10 yards into the field, then curved around and came back again. Another set did the same thing, and another. Whoever had made those footprints had been walking in circles through the field, over and over again, all night. But none of the tracks left the field. They all returned to the same place, back to the Scarecrow. I looked up slowly at the wooden frame in front of me. The coat hung still in the wind. The straw hat hid the top of the figure's head in shadow. And that was when another thought crossed my mind.
If those footprints had been made during the night, then the person who made them had been standing right here, exactly where the Scarecrow was now. I stood there, staring at the Scarecrow for several seconds after that. The wind kept moving through the dry corn around me, making the stalks rattle softly against each other. But the coat on the wooden frame barely moved. It just hung there, heavy, still. The arm inside the sleeve didn't move either. The gray skin stayed stiff around the bones, the fingers slightly curled like they had dried that way. For a moment, I considered running back to the house and calling the sheriff. Finding a body in the middle of your field isn't something you ignore. But something about the situation didn't feel right. The footprints around the Scarecrow were fresh. The dirt was still soft where the shoes had pressed into the ground. If someone had died here long ago, the tracks wouldn't look like that. Someone had been walking in this field recently, walking all night. I stepped closer again, slowly circling around the wooden pole. The Scarecrow stayed perfectly still. From the side, I could see the coat more clearly. The fabric was pulled tight across the shoulders, stretched in a way that made it obvious there was a full body inside it. Not just an arm, a torso, a person. But something about the proportions looked wrong. The coat didn't sit naturally on the wooden frame. The body inside it seemed slightly hunched forward, like the shoulders were bent, like whoever was inside it had collapsed forward at some point. The straw hat covered the top of the figure's head, casting a shadow over the face. I couldn't see what was underneath it, only darkness. I took another careful step forward. The dirt shifted softly under my boots. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wind pushed through the corn again. The sleeve lifted slightly, and the fingers inside the coat twitched. Just a little, barely enough to notice. But I saw it. I froze immediately. My breath caught in my throat. The hand moved again. Not a full movement, just a small tightening of the fingers, like the muscles inside them were trying to work after being stiff for too long. I stared at the sleeve, waiting for it to happen again. The wind died down for a moment. The field became completely quiet.
Then something else moved. Not the hand this time. The hat. The straw hat tilted slightly to one side. Slowly, as if something underneath it had shifted. I took a step backward. My boots scraped softly against the dry soil. The hat stopped moving. For a moment, I thought maybe the wind had caused it. But there was no wind now. The corn stalks stood still around me. The air felt heavy and quiet. Then I noticed something else. The footprints. They weren't the only marks in the dirt. There were drag marks, too. Long, uneven lines pressed into the soil between the rows. I followed one of them with my eyes. It started near the Scarecrow's feet, then stretched several yards through the field, before curving back again. The shape of it made my stomach tighten, because it looked like something had been dragged across the ground. Something heavy. Something that didn't move on its own. And every drag mark ended the same way the footprints did. Back at the Scarecrow. Back at the wooden pole. I looked up again at the figure in front of me. The coat hung motionless. The arm stayed curled inside the sleeve. The hat still covered the top of the head. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that something underneath the coat was watching me, even though I still couldn't see a face. I took another slow step backward, then another. My eyes never left the Scarecrow. The distance between us slowly grew again. 10 feet, 15, 20. Finally, I turned toward the house and started walking back across the field. The dry corn rattled around me as the wind returned. Halfway to the porch, I looked back over my shoulder. The Scarecrow was still standing in the middle of the field, right where I had left it. The same wooden pole, the same coat, the same hat. Nothing had changed. But something about it looked different now. The figure wasn't facing the house anymore. It was facing me.
I didn't stop walking until I reached the porch. My heart was still pounding from what I had just seen in the field. From the house, the Scarecrow looked smaller again, just a dark shape standing between the rows of dry corn. For a few minutes, I told myself the same thing over and over. It was just the wind, just old clothes moving, just my imagination filling in the details. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true, because I had seen the hand move, and I had seen the hat turn. I stood by the kitchen window watching the field for almost an hour. The Scarecrow didn't move again during that time. It stayed in the same place, facing the house. Eventually, the sun climbed higher and the fog burned away from the field. In daylight, everything looked less threatening. Just a wooden pole, just an old coat and hat, just another strange thing on a farm that had been abandoned too long. By late afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that the body inside the coat must have been there for years. Maybe someone had died out there a long time ago. Maybe the previous owner had done something he never told anyone about. Places like this sometimes hide ugly stories. But when the sun started setting that evening, I found myself back at the window again, looking out at the northern field. The light faded slowly across the land until the rows of corn turned into dark lines across the ground. The Scarecrow became a silhouette against the fading sky, and that was when it moved again. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The shape in the field looked slightly different from where it had been before. Closer. Just a little closer to the house. I leaned forward toward the window, staring across the darkening field.
The distance between the Scarecrow and the porch was definitely shorter. Not much, maybe 10 feet, but enough that I could tell it wasn't standing in the same place anymore. I stepped outside onto the porch again. The evening air had turned cold. The wind moved slowly through the dry corn. The Scarecrow stood silently in the middle of the field, but now it was closer than it had been that morning. I stayed there watching it for a long time. The sun disappeared completely, and darkness settled over the farm. The Scarecrow became nothing more than a dark shape against the field. Finally, I went back inside and locked the front door. I closed the curtains and turned off the lights in the living room. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure standing out there, about the footprints circling around it, about the arm inside the coat, and the way the hat had turned toward me. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything. No sound had woken me, but something felt wrong. The kind of feeling you get when someone is standing too close. I walked slowly through the dark house toward the living room window. For a moment I hesitated before pulling the curtain aside. Then I looked out toward the field. The northern field was empty. The Scarecrow was gone. I stared across the rows of corn for several seconds. The wooden pole, the coat, the hat, all of it had disappeared. The field looked exactly the way it had the night before. Nothing standing there, nothing moving. Then I noticed something else, something much closer to the house, right at the edge of the yard. A wooden pole had been pushed into the ground beside the porch. An old coat hung from the crossbeam, and a straw hat sat on top of it. The Scarecrow was no longer in the field. It was standing right outside the house now. I slowly stepped closer to the window. The coat moved slightly in the wind, and for a moment the sleeve lifted. Inside the coat, the gray hand was gone. There was nothing there anymore, just empty fabric moving in the cold night air. That was when I understood something. If the body was no longer inside the Scarecrow, then it had to be somewhere else. I lifted my eyes toward the northern field again. Between the rows of corn, something moved. A dark figure standing among the stalks, and in the moonlight I could see one detail clearly. The figure walking through the field was wearing the same old coat that had been on the Scarecrow. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in the living room with the lights off, watching the porch through a narrow gap in the curtain. The Scarecrow stood exactly where I had seen it, right beside the house. The coat hanging from the wooden frame, the straw hat tilted slightly forward, and nothing inside it. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. The sleeve had lifted in the wind. The coat had opened just enough for me to see through it. There was no body left inside. No arm, no dried skin, no weight. Just empty fabric moving in the dark. Which meant whatever had been inside the Scarecrow earlier that day was now out in the field. Sometime around dawn, I must have drifted off for a few minutes in the chair. When I opened my eyes again, pale morning light was coming through the window. The porch was empty. The Scarecrow was gone. I stood up immediately and pulled the curtain open all the way. Nothing was beside the house. No wooden pole, no coat, no hat. Just the porch steps and the dirt below them. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing from exhaustion. Then I looked toward the northern field. The Scarecrow was back, standing out there between the dry rows of corn. farther away than it had been during the night, as if it had returned to the field before sunrise. I grabbed my boots and went outside. The morning air was cold and still. Everything on the farm looked normal again. The barns, the fence, the road, and out in the field, the Scarecrow, waiting. I didn't walk straight to it this time. Instead, I checked the ground near the porch first. The dirt below the steps was soft enough to show prints. And there they were, fresh footprints. They began right beside the porch where the Scarecrow had stood during the night. Then they moved away from the house, across the yard, through the gate, and into the northern field. I followed them. The tracks cut a clear line through the dirt between the rows of corn. One pair of boots, a man's size, deep enough in places that whoever made them had been carrying some weight or dragging something heavy behind him. As I kept following them, I started seeing another mark beside the prints, a long, shallow line in the dirt, like something wooden had been dragged through the field. The drag mark continued all the way toward the place where the Scarecrow stood. When I reached it, I stopped. The wooden pole was there. The coat was there. The hat was there. But once again, the body inside the coat was still. Too still. I circled around it slowly, keeping my distance. The footprints all ended at the base of the Scarecrow, just like before, as if the man who had walked out of the yard had stepped into that wooden frame and never come back out. I don't know how long I stood there looking at it, trying to decide whether I should call the sheriff or burn the thing where it stood. But before I could do either, I heard a truck coming up the road. It was Walter. He pulled up beside the gate and got out without shutting off the engine. He looked past me toward the Scarecrow and didn't seem surprised to see it. That bothered me more than anything else. I asked him if he knew what it was. Walter kept his eyes on the field. Then he said, "That thing shows up every few years." I asked him what he meant. He took a long breath before answering. "The field used to belong